system test a particular process. The system test will check maybe the entire process and not just a sequence in that process. And then at the very end, our acceptance test makes sure that the bots are actually doing what we set out to do with them. So let's look at some test suite stuff in UiPath Studio. So we'll look at some basic testing over here. And I'll stop debugging for now, and we'll go back to our project. And we don't really need breakpoints anymore. So I will toggle that off. And we'll toggle that off. All right, so if we want to make a test case for this, what we do is in our project panel, you right-click on your XAML file, and then you come down here and select Create Test Case. And this will make a new test case for you. We can name it whatever we want. So I'll call it Demo Test Case. And you see, we could set some data if we needed it. Maybe to test out a workflow, you need a specific set of Excel values. So you know what it takes to trigger the workflow, you know what values it takes to trigger different conditionals throughout the workflow, and you would have a file to work as your test data there. But we're going to do one without anything in particular, and we'll just hit Create. And you'll see that test cases are always in this particular format. You'll see given, when, then. That is all you have to fill out. So for example, let's say we are given what should we be given? Let's keep it simple for now. So let's say that we're given some, log message, and it has an error that says it can't, what is that? We'll have it have operating system error. Don't know. Something like that. But we have this particular error, which I think is a little bit too fancy for what we're trying to do. So let's say it has a runtime. I can put it to... There we go. So let's say we have some kind of runtime error, and when we're given this error, it, invokes the main workflow for some reason. Or let's change this to some info, and we'll say process running. So we have some log message that tells us the process is running. This will invoke the main workflow, and if we're lucky enough to get through the workflow, we'll have some other log message to where we say workflow finished. So this is how you would come in and make a very simple test case. But keep in mind, especially for the exam, that test cases come in the form of a given statement where you will put any values that you need, whether it's from an Excel sheet or PDF or an email. You'll get those values in the given stage. When we are given those values, it will execute some part of our workflow or an activity in particular, and then we will have some type of output that we're looking for. So in our case, we have this employee information that we get from a spreadsheet. When we're given that spreadsheet, it will trigger the main workflow that. Keep in mind, especially for the exam, that test cases come in the form of a given statement where you will put any values that you need, whether it's from an Excel sheet or PDF or an email. You'll get those values in the given stage. When we are given those values, it will execute some part of our workflow or an activity in particular, and then we will have some type of output that we're looking for. So in our case, we have this employee information that we get from a spreadsheet. When we're given that spreadsheet, it will trigger the main workflow that will then have those values in the web application. So this is very, very simple test case. We can save it, and you see over here we have this new XAML file for this particular test case. So now the test case is a part of the project. But let me see, were there any questions on this so far? Because added to any sequence? Yep. You can add a test case to any sequence that you want to. And then, can you show how you drag the test case sequence on the screen? Gotcha. So I'm going to go ahead and close this one. And if you sidebar and right click on your workflow, and then down here kind of towards the bottom, you'll have the create test case option. And then you'll come in here, you'll give it some name. And if you do have any particular data you want to work with, this is where you would declare that source. And then you create the test case, and it gives you these blocks here. But that is how you create a test case. And I didn't have to drag anything on the screen. It was just all through that little widget that we went through here. It just creates another file in the project. So you'll see over here we have another XAML. And then inside of our test case, you can either click on the drop activity here buttons, and it'll bring up all of the activities you can choose from, or you can come over here to the sidebar and click into the activities panel and choose the activities over here. That way, those are the ways that you'll add things to your test case. Sweet. I'm glad that answered your questions. With that being said, if we come back here, all I did was click on process and named it, but why not? Let's just go ahead and do that again so that you all can see. So now we have a completely blank process, and I'm going to go to my main XAML, and it opens this up, and I'll look for a sequence here, because the sequence or your flowchart is like your container for the process. So you'll likely always have your activities inside of a sequence or inside of a flowchart or one of those types of workflows that Studio has. So we'll add a new activity where we'll get some kind of input dialog. So again, one thing that you always want to make sure you do when you're creating these activities is giving them descriptive names. This one isn't going to be that descriptive because we're not doing a whole lot, but let's say make a variable. So that's our sequence. And then in here, we have our input dialog. And one thing I do want to make sure you notice is as I'm clicking these different containers, the properties in the right panel change. So when I go to my input dialog, you can see that there are some different properties versus the sequence. So now we're at the input dialog, we'll give it some title. And remember that UiPath is pretty particular. So when you're entering things into like title and label fields, it'll usually tell you if there should be a quote there or not. But remember to use your double quotes. And we'll do something like username maybe. And you'll see you have a couple of input types for this dialog box, but we'll leave it as a text box. And then down here, you see where we can actually use a variable. So what we'll do is make a new variable, and you see, I just want to make sure that everybody sees. Let me see if I can make this a little bigger. But when we're ready to make a new variable, there are a few options. You can click on this plus here, and it will give you this create variable option in the drop-down. Then at the very bottom here, you'll see in this kind of center panel, we have our variables tab. So you can come in here and just start typing and make a new variable name. So in our case, we've already done that, so we'll call this username. You'll see we have different types that we can use for this variable. So we're just going to leave it as a string. And then for this, we can leave the scope as make variable. And if you did have some kind of default value that you wanted, you can put that in there. But now we have this new variable available for us, and we can target that with username. So I just click on username. This is the variable where our user input gets stored. So UiPath will have access to that variable throughout this entire workflow. And it doesn't just have to be a string. Again, we have a bunch of other data types that we can use. And we'll talk about those a little bit later throughout the course. But this is how you make variables. We can go ahead and clear this and create a new variable and call it username1. And you see down here, it was also created in this variables tab. And again, there's a lot of different places where you can see the details of everything happening in your workflow in Studio. So as we look at the different variables, you can also see the properties over here change. So just look at the name. Right now it's at username. And then I click on the other variable, and now we're at the other username. So it's just a lot of different ways you can work with variables. So sequences are just linear steps that we take to get through a process. A flowchart gives us more flexibility in how we want to break up our processes. So if you know that there's some kind of decision points that are happening throughout your process, flowcharts might be a better candidate because you can separate those concerns a lot easier. And then state machines, that's where we're getting a lot more complex. And then our global exception handler is pretty much always there, because when those errors get thrown as you're running your bots, that's what's going to throw the error, is our global exception handler. And we can add custom exceptions to it. We can update certain rules that we want for errors to stop, or however they affect our workflow execution. But these are some of the most common workflows that you'll run into. And RPA projects use multiple workflows to build out these automations. So if you remember in the debugging example that we looked at very briefly, there were some nested sequences inside of our overall sequence. So you can have sequences in flowcharts. You can have flowcharts that use sequences. You can have state machines that use a combination of all of these things. It just depends on what you need to meet your specific automation requirements. So don't be afraid to play around with different workflows, because there's no right or wrong way to implement a bot. I just want to make sure that you know that there is no right or wrong way. It's just whatever you can get that works, it's consistent, and you can test it. That is a good automation. So now that we know what workflows are, arguments are used to pass data between workflows. So they're really similar to variables, except arguments have a direction. So with arguments, you can put an argument into a workflow. So think of this as like calling a function if you are familiar with code. You know how you can pass different parameters to functions that you call? That's exactly what an argument is like in Studio. You're able to pass a specific value to a workflow in order to get it to execute correctly. So the different directions for arguments are in. So that's when you're just passing an argument into a workflow. Then there's out. That's when you are taking a value from a workflow and you're getting ready to use it elsewhere. And then you have arguments that are in and out. So some arguments, you enter some value, and then on the other side of your workflow, you output the transformed version of that value. So these are the three different directions that you'll see for arguments. And again, it's something that might come up on the exam because they do ask a lot of different questions, but make sure you know that arguments are basically variables with one of these three directions. So arguments are not used between activities. Arguments are used between workflows. So now that we've talked about workflows and arguments, let's just do a quick example of how you make that in where we just made a variable. So I'm actually going to go ahead and delete this, and we'll start fresh. And you'll notice when I deleted the workflow, those variables also got deleted. So let me start by adding a new activity. And this activity is going to be our sequence workflow. So again, sequences are probably the most common type of workflow you'll run into. And that's why you'll see it the most throughout any examples you really go through with UiPath Studio. So we have our sequence. Let's go ahead and add an argument to it. So to add an argument to our sequence, let's go down here and create an argument. And I guess we'll just call it arg1. Or let's do 0, arg0. You see that we have our directions, and property is one of the things that you'll cover most likely in the Advanced Certification course. But for this first exam, you don't really need to know what property does. You just need these first three. And then, of course, you'll need to define what type like what data type you're working with for this particular argument. And that is really all you need. Over here, if you look at the properties for this argument, you'll see we can even determine whether it's required or not. So if we do have some type of argument that has to be present in order for a workflow to execute, we'll make this toggle for is requirement true. So it just toggles on and off. And then let's say we want to, let's just add another activity in here, and let's log them. Let's get an input again, because why not? So we have this input inside of our sequence workflow, and we'll say get username. There we go. With username, that'll be the label for it. And we'll make a variable again called username. And we can see that in our variable panel. And then let's step through and debug this and see what happens, shall we? So now I have this pop-up box, and I'll put in my username here and say okay. And that is actually it. So we have our variable let me see. Over here in my properties, I put a breakpoint on this, and we just run the debug again. Where did that pop go? So now I can step over, put in my username, and click OK. And that's it. So if we continue, everything is looking good. It has the scope of this particular sequence. And that is it. We're good to go there. So you've seen kind of how we work with a little bit of everything at a very basic level. So are there any questions before I keep just marching on here during the exam? So let's go ahead and dive into it. Data types determine what type of data a variable can hold. So that means if I have a variable where the data type is a string, I cannot put a number in there, or I can't make that a Boolean. It's very explicitly defined. And a very, very important thing to note is that the UiPath Studio data types come from VB.NET. So if you're familiar with Visual Basic at all, a lot of the data types that are used, a lot of the code concepts that come up will be very, very familiar to you because Studio pretty much uses VB.NET in the background. It's how it interacts with all of these Microsoft products. So first thing, or first data type, is a string. You'll see it in this system.string format. And again, these are questions that might come up on the exam. Like they might show you what is the data type for a string, and it would be the system.string. And if you're familiar with VB.NET, then that probably makes a lot of sense. But we have our strings, they're used to store text, and they have a lot of different methods that you can work with. And I think we'll look at some of those in the next section of the class. So we've got strings, we've got numbers of different types. So if you know you have a smaller number, you can save a little bit on memory. If you know you have a long integer, go ahead and use that int64. And that might fix some of the issues that come up with your Excel sheets from time to time. And then, of course, you have doubles, which are basically decimals. Next, we have our Boolean data type, which is just a true-false value. Then we start getting into some of the more complex data types. So that means things like collections. A collection is essentially an array. So if you're familiar with any other type of programming language, when you see collections, just remember arrays. And there's a couple of types of collections that Studio uses. The first is just an array, and these store the same type of data. So an array could be an array of strings or an array of numbers, but you won't have an array that has strings, numbers, and Booleans. When you work with arrays, remember you declare the size of that up front, and the size cannot change throughout your workflow or throughout your processes or in any activities. So again, that's something might come up on the test. You never know, but now you do know. And then lists are almost exactly like arrays, except you can change the size of them throughout your workflows, throughout your activities and processes. So they still hold multiple values of the same data type. It's just if you need to add more data to that list, or you need to take data from that list, you're able to do that in a dynamic way. And then the last type of collection are dictionaries. So these are just key value pairs. The keys and the values can have different data types, and they're most similar to objects if you're familiar with other types of programming languages. So you have arrays, lists, and dictionaries to work with more complex data. But keep in mind, again, if for nothing else, the purpose of the exam, remember what these data types look like. So the system.collections. Blah, 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 that's something that might come up on the test that you probably won't normally pay attention to because you'll know what type of data that you're working with. And then kind of like we touched on earlier with the Excel data type, we have data tables, and these act as a small database or a spreadsheet with rows and columns. And of course we have date times because we can't get away from those. So you can have a date time that includes the date and the time in this particular format, or you can have a particular time span. So for some duration of time. And finally, we have the generic value type. So this particular type is only in UiPath. So it's not a part of the VB.net at all, but it's specific to UiPath. And when you encounter any types that start with UiPath dot whatever, it is specific to UiPath functionality. If you encounter a data type that starts with system dot whatever, that's probably something that's built into VB.net. So just a way to tell a little bit of difference between them. So now let's move on to control flows. So a control flow, it determines the order that activities are executed in. So that's when we're getting to our different types of control flows in UiPath Studio. And that means we have our workflow layouts. So first, and what we've been talking about quite a bit, we have our sequences. So these are just, like I've mentioned, they're steps that go in a linear order. That's it. And then with our flowcharts, which did come up, again, it's just like branching out to different sequences. So if there's a decision point, like in the example we looked at in the first section of the class, then we would use a flow chart, because some of those scenarios are pretty complex and you don't want to jumble up your sequences with really convoluted if-else statements that probably won't get you the functionality or the automation that you want anyways. So again, those are some of the workflows that we use to help define our control flow, because those are the containers that all of the activities and everything else go into. And then next we have our control flow statements. So these are the more programmatic type things. If you're familiar with programming as a concept, this is where we get into our if-else, if switch statements. So basically, if there's any conditions where we want to run a specific activity or we want to format a value to a certain thing, we use something like an if statement, an else if statement, or a switch statement. So these are some of the control flows that we have just pretty casually built in. So we'll look at an example of how to use a couple of these in just a second. And then we also have some more types of control flows, which again, if you're familiar with any programming principles, these are some of the more basic concepts that happen in every programming language. So we have our while, do while, and for each loops. So the while loop, it will execute a certain set of activities as long as a condition is met. And I believe with the while loop, that condition is checked. Oh, I see a question. Can we reuse any of the workflows, sequences, or flowcharts? Yes. Yes, you can reuse those workflows. So again, let's say, for example, you have a flowchart workflow, and with each decision point, you want to execute a different sequence or something, or maybe you have nested for charts at a decision point. So you can reuse these workflows in any combination that you want to get your automation working. So hopefully that answered your question. But yeah, we have these different loops. So if we're working with data and we need to cycle through all of the data, we might turn to one of these types of loops. Something that you'll see a lot of are probably the for each loops, just because the way that they handle the check to execute the next loop is more explicit. So when you have a for each loop, it's going to execute for every data point in the set that you give it. But you don't have to worry about if certain conditions are updated or if certain values have been updated. That's just something to keep in mind there. And then we have this parallel control flow, which is something else that will probably get discussed more in the Advanced Certification course. But just to touch on it really quick, when we run things in parallel, that means you're executing multiple activities at the same time. So that could be just 2 activities, or it could be 3 or more activities that happen at the exact same time. And there are certain automation processes that will benefit from parallel execution. For example, with onboarding a new employee, after you have all of their information in the system, then you can trigger activities to send out emails to their team, to add them to the company OnePass account, or to do any number of things that can happen at the same time. They aren't dependent on each other. Oh, I see a question. How do you save them as reusable? I mean, how will I import a workflow in my process main? Gotcha. So if you have a particular chunk of a workflow that you want, you can make that a new file in your project, and then you can import it that way. So that's how you would make a reusable workflow. Hopefully that makes sense. Like, you can save parts of your workflow as files in your project that you can then kind of drag and drop throughout your project. All right, so let's look at these control flows in Studio.